Welcome to the issue at hand, where we break down the policies that shape America and how some of them still impact us today. I'm Joe Beltran, and today we're talking about Ronald Reagan, the man, the myth, the reason we can't have nice things. Reagan is often remembered as an actor turned president, but before he stepped into politics, he was already laying the foundation for the damage that he would do as governor and later as president. The version that Reagan conservatives like to sell is the smiling cowboy that restored America, made the economy strong, and won the Cold War. But when you look at the past, it's a mythology. What you find was a man whose policies are still making life harder for millions of Americans today. The destruction of the middle class, the rise of corporate power, the mass incarceration crisis, student debt, homelessness, even the deep distrust Americans have in their own government, Reagan didn't just contribute to these problems, he built them. Starting back in the 1940s, Reagan was actually a Democrat that supported FDR's New Deal. He even went as far as part of the Screen Actors Guild to advocate for workers' rights in Hollywood. But by the 50s, his politics started shifting. And this wasn't because of some great conviction that he discovered, it's because of money. General Electric hired Reagan as the corporate spokesman, and his job was simple: push anti union philosophies, push anti government philosophies, and push pro business propaganda. He traveled the country preaching about self reliance and free enterprise. But what he was really doing was turning Americans against the very policies that built the middle class. Reagan also could not be trusted. During the Red Scare, Reagan became an FBI informant, helping blacklist actors and writers suspected of being communists. As president of the Screen Actors Guild, he crushed labor strikes and signaled that he was no friend of the working class. By the time he ran for governor in 1966, he was fully backed by corporate interests and was ready to start tearing down the government protections that once helped himself rise. So when we talk about Reagan's impact, it's not just about what he did in office, it's how he spent decades preparing to roll back the New Deal, crush unions, and to hand this country over to big business. And that's exactly what he did. But let's break it down even further. Let's talk about Reagan's war on the New Deal and how he dismantled the safety nets that a lot of Americans depended on. One of the biggest myths about Reagan is that he was just a small government conservative. In reality, he was on a mission to dismantle the legacy of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. The New Deal programs like Social Security, public works programs, union protections, strong banking regulations built the American middle class. But Reagan, he saw it as the enemy. In the 1960s, Reagan called Medicare socialism and said it would lead to totalitarianism. As president, he slashed federal funding for public housing, food assistance, and job programs, saying the government should not interfere with the economy. He pushed for privatizations of Social Security, in a move that, if it was fully realized, would have left millions of seniors without retirement income. The goal was clear: undo everything FDR built. Reagan's attacks on the New Deal wasn't just ideological. It was a way to hand power back to corporations and the wealthy, and we are still dealing with those consequences today in 2025. During Reagan's first inaugural address, Reagan told the American people that the government is not the solution to our problem. The government is our problem. That one line changed everything. Instead of seeing the government as a tool to improve lives, Reagan made people believe that it was the enemy. This was a deliberate effort to destroy public trust so corporations and the wealthy could take control. He pushed the idea that tax were theft instead of an investment in things like roads, schools, and other public services. He framed social programs as harmful, wasteful handouts, making working class Americans resent their own safety nets. He used racial stereotypes like welfare queen, the myth of the welfare queen, to justify cutting programs that helped millions of poor and middle class people. And here we are, decades later, still fighting the same battles. Why? Because Reagan was successful at convincing people to hate their own government. We see that today in the MAGA movement on steroids. Reagan laid the path for the MAGA movement. That distrust in government paved the way for the deregulation, the privatization, and corporate greed. Everything we see in MAGA today, and we are still paying for Reagan's theories and ideas today. Let's talk about something that Reagan fans love to ignore. Much like our current president today, Ronald Reagan was a racist. It wasn't just about bad policies that disproportionately hurt Black and brown Americans. It was deliberate rhetoric and actions that pushed a racist narrative and withheld white supremacy. Issues like the welfare queen myth. Reagan popularized the image of Black women driving Cadillacs while collecting welfare checks. Except this wasn't a real thing. It was a racist dog whistle designed to turn white voters against the social programs. Another one is he opposed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Act of the 1950s. As a private citizen, Reagan opposed both of those landmark civil rights laws, calling them humiliating to the South. He also made racist remarks about African leaders in 1971 when Reagan was caught on tape calling an African delegation to the United Nations monkeys who were still uncomfortable wearing shoes. His states' rights speech that kicked off his campaign in 1980 was given in Mississippi, Philadelphia, Mississippi. In that town in 1964, civil rights workers were murdered. He gave the speech about states' rights in the South. States' rights is a dog whistle in code word that support the Jim Crow laws and the segregation of the South, in the rise of the South, in the lost cause myth of the Civil War. Also, let's not forget his policies reflected his racism. The war on drugs, slashing public education, gutting social programs. These didn't just happen. They were part of a larger strategy to harm Black and brown communities while making white voters think that they were the victim. So another way Reagan showed that he was no friend of the working class was his war on the working class. Before Reagan, unions were very strong, wages were rising, and the working class people had real bargaining power. But in 1981, Reagan fired over 11,000 striking air traffic controllers, sending a message to corporate America: you can crush unions and the government will not stop you. And that's exactly what happened. Since Reagan, union membership has plummeted from 20% of the workers in America in 1980 to under 10% today. Wages have stagnated while CEO pays have skyrocketed to over 1,000%. Companies now routinely use union busting tactics, making it harder for workers to organize. The reason today's workers struggle to get a fair wage and benefit is because Reagan showed corporate America it was okay to union bust. Unions are weaker because of Reagan. Reagan laid the foundations for corporate powers to take over and corporate to be more powerful than the workers. Another way Reagan has waged war on the working class and the middle class is his attack on the higher education system. Before Reagan, colleges in America were affordable, sometimes free. Public universities were heavily funded by the government, making higher education accessible to anyone who wanted it. But Reagan, he started seeing people going through the colleges that he didn't want and he didn't like. And he saw an opportunity for the wrong kind of people, in his opinion, wanting higher education. So he made sure that ended. As governor, he gutted the tuition-free university system in California, and after that, other states followed suit. As president, he slashed federal funding for higher education, forcing colleges to raise their tuition. He also cut the Pell Grant to promote student loans instead, shifting the cost of education onto the students instead of the government, leading to the student debt crisis that we are seeing today. The cost of colleges exploded. The student debt, like I just said, has become a crisis, and today millions of Americans are trapped under loans because Reagan started to push for the privatization of education. Now let's talk about Ronald Reagan's biggest con: trickle-down economics. Reagan sold America a fantasy. Cut the taxes for the rich and the wealth will trickle down to everyone else. Reduce corporate taxes and regulation, and business will create more jobs and raise wages. Shrink the government spending, and the free market will take care of the rest. This wasn't just a policy. It was a deliberate scam designed to transfer wealth from working and middle class to the wealthy elite. And we are still paying that price today. The reality of trickle-down economics were Reagan giving a massive tax cut to the wealthy, much like we saw Donald Trump do in 2017. In 1981, Reagan passed the Economic Recovery Tax Act, which slashed the top income tax rate from 70% to 50%, meaning the richest Americans suddenly got to keep a lot more of their money. By 1986, he cut it even further to 28%, one of the lowest rates of modern history. Meanwhile, he cut the corporate tax rate from 46% to 34%, giving massive handouts to big businesses or corporate welfare. The idea was that lower taxes, the rich would invest in businesses, create jobs, and lift up the whole economy. But that's not what happened. What actually happened was the rich got richer, wages stayed flat. While Reagan's policies made the wealthiest of Americans and corporations richer than they ever have been before, wages for regular workers like me and you, they stayed flat. They stayed stagnant. From 1945 to 1980, the wages and productivity grew together. When a company made more money, so did the workers. But after Reagan's tax cut, that condition broke. Productivity has kept rising, but wages have flatlined. because the corporations no longer had an incentive to share the wealth. Corporate profits soared, jobs disappeared. Instead of trickling down, the corporations hoarded their tax cuts. CEOs gave themselves massive bonus and bought back stocks instead of raising the wages and creating more jobs. Big businesses outsourced overseas and gutted union protections to increase their profits. Also, the federal deficit skyrocketed. Reagan's tax cuts denied the government revenue, creating a massive budget deficit. To make up for it, he slashed funding to social services, cutting programs like housing assistance, Medicaid, and food stamps. Meanwhile, Reagan poured billions into military spending, ballooning the national debt. Another thing that happened was the wealth gap. It exploded. Before Reagan, the richest 1% controlled about 10% of the national wealth. Today, that number has more than doubled to nearly 25% thanks to Reagan's policies and trickle-down economics. The middle class has shrunk, and the poorest Americans are working harder for less money and depending more on government programs, which are constantly being cut as well. We are still living in Reagan's America. Trickle-down economics was a lie, but it's a lie that never went away. Every time a Republican politician pushes for tax cuts for the rich, they're using the same playbook, including Donald Trump. Every time they claim that regulations kill jobs, they are repeating Reagan's corporate propaganda. Every time they say they can't afford health care, education, and social programs, it's because Reagan helped shift the economy in favor of the wealthy. Even Democrats have struggled to undo the Reagan damage because once you cut the taxes for the rich, it's hard to raise them again. But here's the truth. Higher taxes on the wealthy does not kill jobs. It creates a fairer economy. Strong unions and worker protections do not hurt businesses. They strengthen the middle class. Government investment in healthcare, education, and infrastructure does not destroy the economy. It makes the economy work for everyone. Reagan built a system where the rich win and the rest of us struggle. And unless we actively fight to change this, we're going to be stuck in this version of America forever. So, what is the real Reagan legacy? Reagan did not save America. He set us up for decades of inequality, corporate greed, government neglect, and racial divide. But we don't have to keep repeating this history. We can fight for stronger unions and for higher wages, and we can fight to raise the minimum wage. We can push for a progressive tax reform to end the trickle-down economics. We can demand real criminal justice reform and undo the war on drugs. And we can finally reject the lie that the government is the problem. Because when it works for people, we all win. Ronald Reagan, he is why we can't have nice things. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can take it back if we are willing to fight for those nice things. That's been an issue at hand. If you like this video, please hit the like, subscribe button, and we'll keep talking about history and politics and anything else that is shaping the world. Hope to see you next time right here, and keep fighting the good fight.